With spooky season in full effect, I figured it would be a good time to tackle Dead Space 2. And boy was I not disappointed. Dead Space to Dead Space 2 is very much like Alien to Aliens. Large shifts in tone, a more fleshed out universe, and the return of a nightmare thought to have been destroyed. Isaac Clarke returns as the protagonist in Dead Space 2. He suffers from the mid-2000s amnesia syndrome, and has no recollection of the last 3 years since the events on the USG Ishimura. Haunted by his past, Isaac must survive the latest Necromorph outbreak on Titan Station orbiting Saturn. Let's start by talking about the visuals, and wow, they are great. Some of the texture work is noticeably lower res in some areas, but the visuals on a whole still hold up due to the stellar environmental design and lighting work. Areas are distinct in purpose and style. The Church of Unitology is probably one of the most visually memorable areas in a game for me. Most areas in general have a lot more detail to them when compared to the drab bulkheads of the Ishimura. Titan Station looks more like a place where people lived instead of just worked. And it's all the more impressive that they managed to make this run on an Xbox 360. I'm going to take a moment to enter Professor Bones' classroom. Today's is a technical lesson on his favorite 7th generation console. It's important to remember that the Xbox 360 was designed in 2005. It had a single tri-core IBM processor and 512 megabytes of 700Hz DDR3 RAM for memory. The graphics chip is a 500 MHz clock rate and had a 10 megabyte EDRAM cache. I originally used composite cables to plug in the 360 into my CRT TV. My point is that the 360 is ancient now and was old when Dead Space 2 was released in 2011. It is a forever impressive technical feat, even if I'm sure it was capped at 30 frames per second on console. Class dismissed. The design and modeling of the Necromorphs here is really a step above Dead Space 1. These horrors make those Necromorphs look like abstract art. They are fleshier, bloodier, and often more intensely grotesque. The Puker is probably the best example of this. It's walking on a leg made from its own intestines. Most of the suits Isaac wears are much sleeker in this game than the first. I'm still not sure how I feel about it. These suits generally have more detail than those from the first game, but I did love that bulkiness from the first game's suit and the slow progression that came from upgrading just a single suit. Overall, not entirely a bad thing as I get to dress my Isaac up in different outfits. Dead Space 2 is noticeably darker than Dead Space, but I think I prefer that. Areas are just sometimes bright enough where I can see Isaac's rig and the cone of my flashlight. The atmosphere is more intense and lets the game show off the stellar dynamic lighting. Overall, the visuals got a major overhaul and I think it was for the better. Of course, this is a Dead Space game we were talking about, so the weird janky engine returns. There isn't as much physics fun here because Dead Space 2 seems to have gotten a lot more polished than Dead Space 1, but I would still personally activate VSync through your graphics control panel and limit the frames to 60. The mouse controls are about as poor as the first game, so I recommend using a gamepad. Otherwise, there is a mouse fix that exists if you really want to play with one. Enough about the visuals, what about the sound? Well, I'd also argue it's gotten a pretty good overhaul with additions and modifications to the soundscape. The most notable change is the fact that Isaac Clarke is now a voice protagonist.
Who are you?
My name is Dana. I'm the one trying to rescue you.
Why? What's going on?
You're suffering from a unique form of dementia, Isaac. Something you contracted on Aegis 7.
How do you know that? How do you know all this about me?
Your dementia will kill you. But if you can get here, I can treat you and get you to safety.
Why should I trust you?
Because I'm not the one shooting at you.
Fuck.
I remember initially feeling that it would somehow cheapen the experience on release, but I actually quite enjoy speaking Isaac. His character is fairly consistent with that of the logs in the original Dead Space. Isaac has been through a Necromorph outbreak before and he acts like it.
Isaac, it's Dana. You have to dismember the creatures to stop them.
I know. I've had a lot of practice.
He is quippy and an overall very likable character. Props go to Gunnar Wright for bringing Isaac to life. He did all the sound work for Isaac in Dead Space 1 but was uncredited for some reason. The monster noises have been revamped in general, but many old sounds return. Everything is meatier sounding and the weapon sounds seem to have a lot more punch overall. There's also noticeably far more loud moments in this game than the previous installment. These are times where the ambient background noise is replaced by monster yells or jump scares. The ambience work is still fantastic within even those loud moments. General noise is cranked up at the start of the counters to help ratchet up tension and panic. What's most striking to me is the eventual change in background noise. After a certain point, you stop hearing the screams of other survivors, and instead only the occasional clattering or roar of necromorphs. It reinforces the slow reality that you are one of the only people still alive in the station. The music itself is more present than it was in the first game, but that's not such a bad thing. It provided the perfect backdrop to divide necromorphs into pieces. I like the majority of this game's OST because of how subtle and dread-inducing it can be at times. Props go to Jason Graves on creating the OST and the sound engineers for implementation. The only actual complaint I have for the sound is the credits music. It's this out-of-place bit of rock that really doesn't gel with the rest of the game's tone. I'm confused by the choice to this day, mostly because it fades away halfway through and we get spooky music again. The gameplay for Dead Space 2 takes the core of what was in Dead Space and improves upon it. The interface is the same in-universe style from the first game with mostly cosmetic changes. A few controls have been slightly modified, but I personally think it was probably for the better, even if I did use A instead of X to reload multiple times while recording. It's easy to see multiple gameplay improvements over the original right away. Character movement overall has been significantly changed. Isaac moves and feels much sleeker and faster than he did in the first game. He even sways around more as he moves. Isaac's swings and stomps come quicker and are often interspersed with delightful swear words. Maybe it's just my mind goblins, but I swear the aim is a little bit smoother in general using a gamepad. I only have so many words to describe how much more responsive the game feels, so I encourage you to try it out for yourself. Dead Space's signature dismemberment combat returns and it's gotten its own little twist. While you could throw severed body parts at enemies before, these body parts often do significantly more damage now. This is often helpful because Dead Space 2 tends to give the player fewer resources on higher difficulties. I personally think this change is great because I was pretty loaded down in resources by the end of the first game. I mean, I was still loaded down here, but it was to a noticeably lesser extent than in Dead Space 1. Stasis has gotten a pretty important change. The duration of how long enemies are in stasis is much shorter than the first game. The upside is that the meter recharges itself over time. It's a fairly long recharge that can be reduced with upgrades. The duration can also be upgraded to a shadow of its former self. Rip the OP Dead Space 1 stasis. The signature Tell Me Where to Go button has gotten a pretty significant upgrade from the first game. Instead of just giving you the shortest path to an objective, it also allows you to cycle through different locations including stores, benches, and save stations. This is a very handy function to include considering they removed the map I never used from the last game. It's often very hard to get lost as this game is mostly linear, with the exception of the Church of Unitology. It has always felt like a streamlined Resident Evil mansion to me. There's still only one path through, but the church has a safe room and multiple doors that can be unlocked as shortcuts. The weapon selection is still mainly industrial equipment, but there's a noticeable uptick in the amount of military weapons available. This can be explained away with a change in setting, but it's set a worrying standard that would be carried over to Dead Space 3. No, not yet. That can of worms will be its own video. To be perfectly honest, I'm nowhere near as familiar with the weapons of this game as I am with the first. My usual weapon selection includes the refurbished plasma cutter, pulse rifle, ripper, and the contact beam. I would encourage you to explore around with the weapons in this game to find which ones you would like. I still feel qualified enough to share my opinions on these weapons, but not enough to say that you should actually listen to them. The plasma cutter is bae. The force gun and line gun have practically not changed since the first game. Both are decent options, but still aren't for me. The flamethrower seems to do more damage and eats up less fuel. I still don't recommend it due to a lack of range. The pulse rifle has gotten a pretty significant overhaul. Its primary fire is the same, but the secondary has been completely changed. Instead of firing in every direction at once, it lobs a grenade at where you point. I actually much prefer this as a method of crowd control. I still have control over my positioning rather than locking into place. The Ripper is better known by its stage name, the Child Slayer 9000. It's sleeker and smaller than in Dead Space, but functions exactly the same. The contact beam is once again a problem solver. It starts out dealing maximum damage for extra spiciness. The javelin gun is the first of the new weapons in Dead Space 2. It fires a spike that will pin Necromorphs to walls. The secondary makes the spike electrify those nearby. It's fine, but requires precision and accuracy to use. It also doesn't pin anything bigger than your average slasher. I've never used a rivet gun. I have no real interest in using a weapon that was only available as pre-order DLC. The detonator is one of the new military weapons. It's a mine layer. It shoots trip mines that stick to any surface. Useful in setting up an ambush, and you can even pick up the mines for later use with the secondary. Or we could always cut out the middleman and just shoot mines at Necromorphs. I don't really like it. The explosions can knock you down and leave you open to attack. The Seeker rifle is a sniper rifle. That's really all that's to this weapon. It's meant for long range fighting, and its secondary is just a zoom. I really don't like the Seeker. Most Necromorphs like to get in close. It becomes nearly useless at that distance. There's also a super secret joke weapon you can unlock by beating the hardcore mode. It's called the hand cannon and is literally a giant foam finger. Isaac says pew pew or bang bang when it fires. 10 out of 10, best weapon in the game. These weapons can once again be upgraded at benches using power nodes. There have been two notable changes to the upgrade system. The first and most important is the inclusion of a respec option. It costs 5,000 credits but will refund all the nodes you put into a weapon. Your mistakes in node geometry are no longer as punishing. The second change is the inclusion of special modifiers on certain weapons. For instance, the special upgrade for the plasma cutter makes its shots flaming. These specials are usually worth the large investment in nodes. Just remember to carry a node on you at all times. You never know when you might find a room full of treats. The nodes are found in their usual blue cubbies or can be purchased from stores. What the fuck? Okay, a little bit of explanation needed. There's an absolute ton of DLC and pre-order nonsense for Dead Space 2. It was an EA game after all. People dug around in the files and found out all this stuff was already in the PC version of the game even if you didn't buy the DLC. So privateers did their thing, and EA said fuck it, it's available free on PC. Which results in all this mess. There is a way you can remove the DLC, but I would not recommend the majority of players to go digging around their files on this one. Instead, buy all the weapons and transfer them into the safe at the first store in the game. It takes like 3 minutes to do, and the store page is significantly decluttered as a result. I wouldn't recommend using any of the DLC weapons or suits on your first playthrough, but you do you. Besides the clutter and visual redesign, the stores function in the exact same way as the first Dead Space. Spend credits on suits or items. Bring in schematics for new weapons and items. Same stuff, new game. Zero Gravity has received the most significant overhaul of all. Gone are the days of jumping from wall to wall. We now have 3-dimensional movement in a vacuum. It controls really well in my opinion. There's a button to reorient yourself to ground in case you become disoriented. It happens surprisingly often, and I had to rely on this button more than a few times. Overall, these Zero Gravity sections are the ones with the most improved gameplay. I honestly think this was all for the better. Saying 0G movement in Dead Space 1 was clunky is being generous. Ignore the conduit rooms. They are your in-game reward for having a Dead Space ignition save on your system. It was a console-exclusive motion comic puzzle game. Neat concept, poor execution, meh art. You can mod these conduit rooms open, but I've never opened them, so I have no idea what's inside. I just know it's not necessary to beat the game. This now brings us to the Necromorphs. Most of the originals return, and there are multiple types of new reanimated tissue golems for you to combat. A few are boss monsters, including this really cool one called the Tormentor. You see it once and never again. But Dead Space 2 makes sensible additions to the roster. The Starkest are the Pack, or zombie children as I call them. They are literally necromorphized kids. Their existence helps to sell the fact that Titan Station is a place with kids and families. If there's a giant dementia-inducing zombie rock, of course it's going to affect the children. I give Visceral Posthumous props for having the willpower to show this kind of unsettling horror. Other fascinating new enemies include the cysts on the walls, the puker, exploding babies, 0G bullet hell enemies, and quite possibly my favorite enemy in the series, the Stalker. Stalkers are essentially the necromorph version of velociraptors from Jurassic Park. They hunt in groups and do their best to surround you and catch you off guard. Having your back to a wall is a viable strategy against these guys. Don't at me because I didn't talk about all the palette swap variants. Overall, necromorphs are still one of my favorite sci-fi horror enemies. You can't reason with a flesh bag that only wants to create more dead flesh for convergence. Criticism. I actually have a fair amount of it for Dead Space 2. More than I thought I was originally going to have. My least favorite design choice is also probably the simplest. How items drop from enemies. In Dead Space 1, when you killed an enemy, they would either drop an item or not when they died. In Dead Space 2, there's an added step to this process where you need to stomp bodies to gather loot. I can see the original intent behind this being to add an extra step to collecting a resource. This could set up intense situations organically and would allow for some intense scripted ambush scenarios. However, this is a problem for me. I spend more time focusing on stomping bodies than my own well-being in a fight. Due to the technical limitations of the 7th generation consoles, there could only be so many corpses on screen at any given time, and if you were to look away for long enough, the corpses would disappear entirely. This results in lost resources and the potential for a tougher playthrough. It was a well-intentioned choice that I don't think panned out in the way they wanted. There's a significant number of times in Dead Space 2 where meaningful control is removed from the player, and I'm not talking about the dragging sequences where you shoot a thing, even though there are still some of those. I'm instead talking about all these crazy set piece and action moments. They feel kind of out of place when compared to the usual corridor walking. There are a number of times where a simple button mash got me out of a situation. Not to say that some of these sequences aren't a lot of fun. I'm personally a huge fan of the train car sequence where you're held upside down. I know that this series was beginning to head down a more action-y route, but it felt jarring to enter these sequences at times. Almost like swapping between two different games on the same disc. My last bit of criticism is that the final boss is honestly a complete letdown. It's thematically appropriate, but pales in comparison to the spectacle that was the hive mind. Saying anything more would be spoilers. Pivoting to the story, Dead Space 2 answers a curiosity I had at the end of the first game. What if the Necromorph outbreak had occurred in a major population center? The Aegis 7 incident involved roughly 2,000 people. What about a city of 1 million? Dead Space 2 begins in the middle of a large-scale outbreak on Titan Station. Isaac Clarke is rescued from a mental hospital and is soon after on the run from his newly necromorphized savior. Isaac must fight his way out of the sprawl and finally face his demons. Isaac gets support along the way from some great characters like Nolan Strauss and Ellie Langford. Dead Space 2 expands upon the lore of the first game and even subtly includes the effects of the first game on the world. While there isn't the outright mystery of the first game, there are still enough questions to be asked. Why doesn't Isaac remember anything of the last 3 years of his life? How can the Necromorphs be back after the marker was destroyed on Aegis 7? The answers to these questions lie behind spoiler tags, so if you want to avoid them, go here. Isaac wakes up in a hospital with no memory, a lady yelling at him on the phone, and necromorphs all over the place. Effectively for Isaac, it's been almost no time since the events of the Ishimura due to his memory loss. But it's okay because that just means he still has his limb-cutting chops. Isaac navigates through the mass panic, unwittingly making his way to a local church of Unitology. There we learn more about how this is still totally not a metaphor for Scientology.
Today, the Church of Unitology can be found everywhere in the known universe. Its message is just as strong and relevant today as it was when Altman first revealed it.
Nope, not at all. Dead Space 2 does a great job at showing off the insanity of Unitology. As a player, you have some understanding of the eldritch dangers of markers. And to see people building entire churches to worship them is more than a little unsettling. It shows just how disconnected from reality Unitologists are. They worship something they couldn't possibly hope to understand. Isaac is betrayed by a woman again and vows to never trust another. Then he meets Ellie and is like, hey baby. All the while, Isaac is haunted by hallucinations of his dead girlfriend Nicole from the first game. Some are very effective and show Isaac's mind is working against him. And then there's this one scene where Nicole is spinning this kid's playground toy. It's never been scary, just really funny and weird. Like, who are you trying to scare? En route to the government sector, our trio of survivors is forced to take a detour through the decommissioned USG Ishimura. In one of the greatest sequences in a game ever, you return to where the nightmare began. The ship is eerily quiet and sterile, but the longer you are aboard, the more horrors reveal themselves. Much of the ship's layout is exactly the same, down to save station and store locations. Isaac eventually ejects himself into the mines below the government sector. It is here Strauss finally snaps and nearly kills Ellie, taking one of her eyes with a screwdriver. Isaac deals with the Strauss problem. The duo resolve to continue forward and drill their way into the government sector. It is in the mines that Isaac comes to terms with the hallucination Nicole.
Because you are my everything. And if I let you go, I've got nothing left.
He also learns the next step to his 4-step program. In the government sector, Isaac manages to save his new lady before inviting all the flesh beasts inside the secure zone. Exploring the government sector, you come to realize that EarthGov was performing large-scale experimentation and manufacture of markers. There are literally dozens of markers in the making inside this lab. It shows the extent to which EarthGov has gone to try to fix the energy crisis. Let's talk some Dead Space history. Humanity is running out of resources in the Dead Space universe. There are too many humans and we consume so much that we are literally absorbing all of the inorganic matter of the galaxy into our society. Hence why there are planet-cracking ships like the Ishimura. But the biggest planet-cracking ship, underwent what appeared to be a major terrorist incident. This results in the entire industry entering a slump that affects the livelihood of everyone on Titan Station. There is a solution to this problem, and it's not a good one. You see, in the time after Isaac escaped Aegis 7, he was captured by EarthGov for the knowledge retained in his head. Isaac might have destroyed the marker, but it imprinted itself upon him in the form of his dementia. This dementia contains the instructions on how to create another marker. The markers cause horrible things, but at the same time also supply limitless energy from a source unknown. EarthGov figured they could control such a thing, but as you learn from a scientist's log, it was really the other way around. The markers are effectively making humanity replicate them for some unknown purpose. It's a great setup and expands upon the lore set up by the first game. It also helps me understand Tybin more and the reasoning behind his decision making. Traveling deeper into the facility results in finding the mother of all markers. The Site-12 marker is gargantuan in size. A room nearby contains the machine to activate Isaac's marker memories. Unfortunately, the only way to do so is to stick a needle in your eye, cross your heart, and hope to die. Hallucinatory Nicole disappears, and we are then hunted by what is affectionately known as the Ubermorph. It visually appears to be a proto-hive mind, but we never get confirmation, nor are we entirely sure what happens to the thing. It just kinda disappears during the last section of the game. At the foot of the marker, you finally come face to face with Tybin, who is really messed up. Like, I'm surprised he was still breathing messed up. There's a tussle for the gun before Isaac winds up victorious. Ready to end the nightmare, Isaac goes to hug Hallucination Nicole, but is instead thrust into the depths of his own mind. Turns out the marker wants to consume its creator to prevent him from destroying it. Thematically, it's actually pretty great as Isaac is fighting the marker's influence over him. The execution leaves something to be desired. Nicole just walks at you slowly while you're attacked by ghost zombie children from all sides. The hive mind was a superior fight. Eventually the scuffle is won and Isaac's victory causes the marker to begin to crumble around him. It is a memorable moment because Isaac just sits there and resigns himself to his fate. He stopped the marker. He saved Ellie. He put Nicole to rest. His job's finally over. The credits even begin to roll before being thrust aside by Ellie, who is having none of Isaac's shit.
Was this your great plan? Dump me off and die?
She ain't no damsel. Cue action and escape sequence and we make it aboard the ship just before the entire station explodes. There's a really great callback to the end of Dead Space here. It starts with a close-up shot of Isaac looking at a display in front of him. He then begins to warily turn to the side and music swells a bit, only for us to find Ellie, who asks Isaac what's wrong. It's a great fake-out. I originally was half expecting Isaac to see another marker-induced hallucination. Overall, I think the characters and story of this game were on par, if not better, than the original Dead Space. It manages to straddle the line between action and horror more often than not. Seeing as this was a game released in the early teens, Dead Space 2 included a somewhat tacked-on multiplayer component to the game. It's surprisingly still functional, when you can find a game, which I cannot. So once again, I have to rely upon memory. I didn't play a lot of it back in the day, despite the concept of humans versus necromorphs sounding like a lot of fun. I was not a huge fan because of how clunky it felt in practice. It was probably a consequence of bad netcode or my then garbage tier network connection. A major design flaw I remember is how necromorphs can only spawn out of vents, leading to some pretty predictable spawn camping. It had Left 4 Dead 2 multiplayer vibes with none of the substance. In conclusion, Dead Space 2 is a worthy sequel to the original. It's better technically and improves upon the gameplay in nearly every way. It expands upon the universe of the original and is a great excuse to dismember more necromorphs. Is it a better game than the first? I would argue it's a better game, but do I like it more than Dead Space 1? No, I think the first is still my favorite in the end. I much prefer the mystery of the original game. Maybe it's nostalgia, but that's just me. You can purchase Dead Space 2 on Steam or Origin, but I recommend waiting for a sale. $20 is a little steep for a 10-year-old game. Though I'm pretty sure EA is still trying to recoup losses from the development and marketing of this game. Thanks for watching.